Lord Felmet looked carefully at the 2 coins in his lap. Then he looked at his tax-gatherer. "Well," he said. The tax-gatherer cleared his throat. "Well, sir, you see, I explained about the need to employ a standing army, etc., and they said why, and I said because of bandits, etc., and they said bandits never bothered them." "And civil works?" "Ah, yes. Well, I pointed out the need to build and maintain bridges, etc. And they said they didn't use them." "Ah," said the Duke knowledgeably. "They can't cross running water." "Not sure about that, sir. I think witches cross anything they like." "Did they say anything else?" said the Duke. The tax-gatherer twisted the hem of his robe distractedly. "Well, sir, I mentioned how taxes help to maintain the king's peace, sir." "And?" "They said the king should maintain his own peace, sir. And then they gave me a look." "What sort of a look?" The Duke sat with his thin face cupped in one hand. He was fascinated. "It's sort of hard to describe," said the taxman. He tried to avoid Lord Felmet's gaze, which was giving him the distinct impression that the tiled floor was fleeing away in all directions and had already covered several acres. Lord Felmet's fascination was to him what a pin is to a purple emperor. "Try," the Duke invited. The taxman blushed. "Well," he said, it wasn't nice." Which demonstrates that the tax-gatherer was much better at figures than words. What he would have said if embarrassment, fear, poor memory, and a complete lack of any kind of imagination hadn't conspired against it was, "When I was a little boy and staying with my aunt, and she had told me not to touch the cream, etc., and she had put it on a high shelf in the pantry, and I got a stool and went after it when she was out anyway, and she'd come back and I didn't know, and I couldn't reach the bowl properly and it smashed on the floor, and she opened the door and glared at me. It was that look. But the worst thing was, they knew it." "Not nice," said the Duke. "No, sir." The Duke drummed the fingers of his left hand on the arm of his throne. The tax-gatherer coughed again. You're not going to force me to go back, are you?" he said. Said the Duke. He waved a hand irritably. No, he said, "not at all. Just call in at the torturer on your way out. See when he can fit you in." The taxman gave him a look of gratitude and bobbed a bow. "Yes, sir. At once, sir. Thank you, sir. You're very—" Yes, said Lord Felmet absently. "You may go." The Duke was left alone in the vastness of the hall. It was raining again. Every once in a while a piece of plaster smashed down on the tiles, and there was a crunching from the walls as they settled still further. The air smelled of old cellars. Gods, he hated this kingdom. It was so small, only 40 miles long and maybe 10 miles wide, and nearly all of it was cruel mountains with ice-green slopes and knife-edged crests or dense huddled forests. A kingdom like that shouldn't be any trouble. What he couldn't quite fathom was this feeling that it had depth. It seemed to contain far too much geography. He rose and paced the floor to the balcony with its unrivalled view of trees. It struck him that the trees were also looking back at him. He could feel the resentment. But that was odd, because the people themselves hadn't objected. They didn't seem to object to anything very much. Verence had been popular enough in his way. There'd been quite a turnout for the funeral. He recalled the lines of solemn faces. Not stupid faces, by no means stupid. Just preoccupied, as though what kings did wasn't really very important. He found that almost as annoying as trees. Jolly good riot, now that would have been more appropriate. One could have ridden out and hanged people. There would have been the creative tension so essential to the proper development of the state. Back down on the plains, if you kicked people, they kicked back. Up here, when you kicked people, they moved away and just waited patiently for your leg to fall off. How could a king go down in history ruling a people like that? You couldn't oppress them any more than you could oppress a mattress. He had raised taxes and burned a few villages on general principles, just to show everyone who they were dealing with. It didn't seem to have any effect. And then there were these witches. They haunted him. Fool! The fool, who'd been having a quiet doze behind the throne, awoke in terror. Yes! Come hither, fool. The fool jingled miserably across the floor. Tell me, fool, does it always rain here? Marry, nuncle? Just answer the question, said Lord Felmet with iron patience. Sometimes it stops, sir, to make room for the snow, and sometimes we get some right squandering augulous fogs, said the fool. Augulous, said the Duke absently. The fool couldn't stop himself. His horrified ears heard his mouth blurt out, Thick, my lord, from the Lutatian augulum, a soup or broth. But the Duke wasn't listening. Listening to the prattle of underlings was not, in his experience, particularly worthwhile. I am bored, fool. Let me entertain you, my lord, with many a merry quip and lightsome jest. Try me. The fool licked his dry lips. He hadn't actually expected this. King Verence had been happy enough just to give him a kick or throw a bottle at his head. A real king. I'm waiting. Make me laugh. The fool took the plunge. Why, sirrah, he quavered, why may a caudled fill-horse be deemed the brother to a Hiren candle in the night? The Duke frowned. The fool felt it better not to wait. Withal, because a candle may be greased, yet a fill-horse be without a fat arguer, he said, and because it was part of the joke, patted Lord Felmet lightly with his balloon on a stick and twanged his mandolin. The Duke's index finger tapped an abrupt tattoo on the arm of the throne. Yes, he said. And then what happened? That, was by way of being the whole thing, said the fool, and added, My grandad thought it was one of his best. I dare say he told it differently, said the Duke. He stood up. Summon my huntsman. I think I shall ride out on the chase. And you can come too. My lord, I cannot ride. For the first time that morning, Lord Felmet smiled. Capital, he said. We will give you a horse that can't be ridden. Ha ha! He looked down at his bandages, and afterwards he told himself, I'll get the armourer to send me up a file. A year went past. The days followed one another patiently. Right back at the beginning of the multiverse, they had tried all passing at the same time, and it hadn't worked. Tom John sat under Hooel's rickety table, watching his father as he walked up and down between the latties, waving one arm and talking. Vittula always waved his arms when he spoke. If you tied his hands behind his back, he would be dumb. All right, he was saying. How about the king's brides? Last year, said the voice of Hoel. All right, then. We'll give them Mallow the Tyrant of Clatch, said Vittula, and his larynx smoothly changed gear as his voice became a great rolling thing that could rattle the windows across the width of the average town square. In blood I came, and by blood rule, that none will dare essay these walls of blood. We did it the year before, said Hoel calmly. Anyway, people are fed up with kings. They want a bit of a chuckle. They are not fed up with my kings, said Vittula. My dear boy, people do not come to the theatre to laugh. They come to experience, to learn, to wonder. To laugh, said Hoel flatly. Have a look at this one. Tom John heard the rustle of paper and the creak of wickerwork as Vittula lowered his weight onto a props basket. A wizard of sorts, Vittula read. Or please yourself. Hoel stretched his legs under the table and dislodged Tom John. He hauled the boy out by one ear. What's this? Said Vittula. Wizards, demons, imps, merchants? I'm rather pleased with Act 2, Scene 4, said Hoel, propelling the toddler towards the props box. Comic washing up with 2 servants. Any deathbed scenes? said Vittula hopefully. No, said Hool, but I can do you a humorous monologue in Act 3. A humorous monologue? All right, there's room for a soliloquy in the last act, said Hool hurriedly. I'll write one tonight, no problem. And a stabbing, said Vittula, getting to his feet. A foul murder. That always goes down well. He strode away to organise the setting up of the stage. Hool sighed and picked up his quill. Somewhere behind the sacking walls was the town of Hangdog, which had somehow allowed itself to be built in a hollow perched in the nearly sheer walls of a canyon. There was plenty of flat ground in the ram tops. The problem was that nearly all of it was vertical. Hool didn't like the ram tops, which was odd because it was traditional dwarf country, and he was a dwarf. But he'd been banished from his tribe years ago, not only because of his claustrophobia, but also because he had a tendency to daydream. It was felt by the local dwarf king that this is not a valuable talent for someone who is supposed to swing a pickaxe without forgetting what he is supposed to hit with it. And so Hool had been given a very small bag of gold, the tribe's heartfelt best wishes, and a firm goodbye. It had happened that Vittula's strolling players had been passing through at the time, and the dwarf had ventured one small copper coin on a performance of the Dragon of the Plains. He had watched it without a muscle moving in his face, gone back to his lodgings, and in the morning had knocked on Vittula's latte with the first draft of King Under the Mountain. It wasn't in fact very good, but Vittula had been perceptive enough to see that inside the hairy bullet head was an imagination big enough to bestride the world, and so, when the strolling players strolled off, one of them was running to keep up. Particles of raw inspiration sleep through the universe all the time. Every once in a while, one of them hits a receptive mind, which then invents DNA, or the flute sonata form, or a way of making light bulbs wear out in half the time. But most of them miss. Most people go through their lives without being hit by even one. Some people are even more unfortunate. They get them all. Such a one was Hool. Enough inspirations to equip a complete history of the performing arts poured continuously into a small, heavy skull designed by evolution to do nothing more spectacular than be remarkably resistant to axe blows. He licked his quill and looked bashfully around the camp. No one was watching. He carefully lifted up the wizard and revealed another stack of paper. It was another potboiler. Every page was stained with sweat, and the words themselves scrawled across the manuscript in a trellis of blots and crossings out and tiny scribbled insertions. Hool stared at it for a moment, alone in a world that consisted of him, the next blank page, and the shouting, clamouring voices that haunted his dreams. He began to write. Free of Hool's never-too-stringent attention, Tom John pushed open the lid of the props hamper and, in the methodical way of the very young, began to unpack the crowns. The dwarf stuck out his tongue as he piloted the errant quill across the ink-speckled page. He'd found room for the star-crossed lovers, the comic gravediggers, and the hunchback king. It was the cats and the roller skates that were currently giving him trouble. A gurgle made him look up. "For goodness sake, lad," he said. "It hardly fits. Put it back." The disc rolled into winter. Winter in the Ramtops could not honestly be described as a magical, frosty wonderland, each twig laced with confections of brittle ice. Winter in the Ramtops didn't mess about. It was a gateway straight through to the primeval coldness that lived before the creation of the world. Winter in the Ramtops was several yards of snow, the forests a mere collection of shadowy green tunnels under the drifts. Winter meant the coming of the lazy wind, which couldn't be bothered to blow around people and blew right through them instead. The idea that winter could actually be enjoyable would never have occurred to Ramtop people, who had 18 different words for snow.
All of them, unfortunately, unprintable.
The ghost of King Verence prowled the battlements, bereft and hungry, and stared out across his beloved forests, and waited his chance. It was a winter of portents. Comets sparkled against the chilled skies at night. Clouds shaped mightily like whales and dragons drifted over the land by day. In the village of Razorback, a cat gave birth to a two-headed kitten, but since Grebo, by dint of considerable effort, was every male ancestor for the last 30 generations, this probably wasn't all that portentous. However, in Badass, a cockerel laid an egg and had to put up with some very embarrassing personal questions. In Lanka Town, a man swore he'd met a man who had actually seen with his own eyes a tree get up and walk. There was a short, sharp shower of shrimps. There were odd lights in the sky. Geese walked backwards. Above all of this flared the great curtains of cold fire that were the aurora coriolis, the hub lights, whose frosty tints illuminated and coloured the midnight snows. There was nothing the least unusual about any of this. The ramtops, which, as it were, lay across the disk's vast magical standing wave like an iron bar dropped innocently across a pair of subway rails, were so saturated with magic that it was constantly discharging itself into the environment. People would wake up in the middle of the night, mutter, "Oh, it's just another bloody portent," and go back to sleep. Hogswatch night came round, marking the start of another year. And with alarming suddenness, nothing happened. The skies were clear, the snow deep and crisped like icing sugar. The freezing forests were silent and smelled of tin. The only things that fell from the sky were the occasional fresh showers of snow. A man walked across the moors from Razorback to Lanka Town without seeing a single marshlight, headless dog, strolling tree, ghostly coach or comet, and had to be taken in by a tavern and given a drink to unsteady his nerves. The stoicism of the ramtoppers, developed over the years as a sovereign resistance to the thaumaturgical chaos, found itself unable to cope with the sudden change. It was like a noise which isn't heard until it stops. Granny Weatherwax heard it now as she lay snug under a pile of quilts in her freezing bedroom. Hogswatch night is, traditionally, the one night of the disk's long year when witches are expected to stay at home, and she'd had an early night in the company of a bag of apples and a stone hot water bottle. But something had awoken her from her doze. An ordinary person would have crept downstairs, possibly armed with a poker. Granny simply hugged her knees and let her mind wander. It hadn't been in the house. She could feel the small, fast minds of mice and the fuzzy minds of her goats as they lay in their cosy flatulence in the outhouse. A hunting owl was a sudden dagger of alertness as it glided over the rooftops. Granny concentrated harder, until her mind was full of the tiny chittering of the insects in the thatch and the woodworm in the beams. Nothing of interest there. She snuggled down and let herself drift out into the forest, which was silent except for the occasional muffled thump as snow slid off a tree. Even in midwinter, the forest was full of life, usually dozing in burrows or hibernating in the middle of trees. All as usual. She spread herself further, to the high moors and secret passes where the wolves ran silently over the frozen crust. She touched their minds, sharp as knives. Higher still, and there was nothing in the snowfields but packs of vermin.
The vermin is a small black and white furry creature much famed for its pelt. It is a more careful relative of the lemming. It only throws itself over small pebbles.
Everything was as it should be, with the exception that nothing was right. There was something. Yes, there was something alive out there, something young and ancient, and... Granny turned over the feeling in her mind. Yes, that was it. Something forlorn, something lost, and... Feelings were never simple, Granny knew, Strip them away and there were others underneath. Something that, if it didn't stop feeling lost and forlorn very soon, was going to get angry. And still she couldn't find it. She could feel the tiny mines of chrysalises down under the frozen leaf mould. She could sense the earthworms which had migrated below the frost line. She could even sense a few people who were hardest of all. Human minds were thinking so many thoughts all at the same time that they were nearly impossible to locate. It was like trying to nail fog to the wall. Nothing there. Nothing there. The feeling was all around her, and there was nothing to cause it. She'd gone down about as far as she could, to the smallest creature in the kingdom, and there was nothing there. Granny Weatherwax sat up in bed, lit a candle and reached for an apple. She glared at her bedroom wall. She didn't like being beaten. There was something out there, something drinking in magic, something growing, something that seemed so alive it was all around the house, and she couldn't find it. She reduced the apple to its core and placed it carefully in the tray of the candlestick. Then she blew out the candle. The cold velvet of the night slid back into the room. Granny had one last try. Perhaps she was looking in the wrong way. A moment later she was lying on the floor with a pillow clasped around her head. And to think she had expected it to be small. Lancre Castle shook. It wasn't a violent shaking, but it didn't need to be, the construction of the castle being such that it swayed slightly even in a gentle breeze. A small turret toppled slowly into the depths of the misty canyon. The fool lay on his flagstones and shivered in his sleep. He appreciated the honour, if it was an honour, but sleeping in the corridor always made him dream of the Fool's Guild, behind whose severe grey walls he had trembled his way through 7 years of terrible tuition. The flagstones were slightly softer than the beds there, though. A few feet away, a suit of armour jingled gently. Its pike vibrated in its mailed glove until, swishing through the night air like a swooping bat, it slid down and shattered the flagstone by the fool's ear. The fool sat up and realised he was still shivering. So was the floor. In Lord Felmet's room, the shaking sent cascades of dust down from the ancient four-poster. He awoke from a dream that a great beast was trampling around the castle and decided with horror that it might be true. A portrait of some long-dead king fell off the wall. The Duke screamed. The fool stumbled in, trying to keep his balance on a floor that was now heaving like the sea, and the Duke staggered out of bed and grabbed the little man by his jerkin. "What's happening?" he hissed. "Is it an earthquake?" "We don't have them in these parts, my lord," said the fool, and was knocked aside as a chaise longue drifted slowly across the carpet. The Duke dashed to the window and looked out at the forests in the moonlight. The white-capped trees shook in the still night air. A slab of plaster crashed onto the floor. Lord Felmet spun around, and this time his grip lifted the fool a foot off the floor. Among the very many luxuries the Duke had dispensed with in his life was that of ignorance. He liked to feel he knew what was going on. The glorious uncertainties of existence held no attraction for him. "It's the witches, isn't it?" he growled, his left cheek beginning to twitch like a landed fish. "They're out there, aren't they? They're putting an influence on the castle, aren't they?" "Marry, nuncle," the fool began. "They run this country, don't they?" "No, my lord, they've never—" "Who asked you?" The fool was trembling with fear in perfect antiface to the castle, so that he was the only thing that now appeared to be standing perfectly still. You did, my lord," he quavered. "Are you arguing with me?" "No, my lord." "I thought so. You're in league with them, I suppose." "My lord," said the fool, really shocked. "You're all in league, you people," the Duke snarled. "The whole bunch of you. You're nothing but a pack of ringleaders." He flung the fool aside and thrust the tall windows open, striding out into the freezing night air. He glared out over the sleeping kingdom. "Do you all hear me?" he screamed. "I am the king!" The shaking stopped, catching the Duke off balance. He steadied himself quickly and brushed the plaster dust off his nightshirt. "Right then," he said. But this was worse. Now the forest was listening. The words he spoke vanished into a great vacuum of silence. There was something out there. He could feel it. It was strong enough to shake the castle, and now it was watching him, listening to him. The Duke backed away very carefully, fumbling behind him for the window catch. He stepped carefully into the room, shut the windows, and hurriedly pulled the curtains across. "I am the king," he repeated quietly. He looked at the fool, who felt that something was expected of him. "The man is my lord and master," he thought. "I have eaten his salt, or whatever all that business was. They told me at guild school that a fool should be faithful to his master until the very end, after all others have deserted him. Good or bad doesn't come into it. Every leader needs his fool. There is only loyalty. That's the whole thing. Even if he is clearly 3 parts bonkers, I'm his fool until one of us dies." To his horror, he realized the Duke was weeping. The fool fumbled in his sleeve and produced a rather soiled red and yellow handkerchief embroidered with bells. The Duke took it with an expression of pathetic gratitude and blew his nose. Then he held it away from him and gazed at it with demented suspicion. "Is this a dagger I see before me?" he mumbled. No, my lord, it's my handkerchief, you see. You can sort of tell the difference if you look closely. It doesn't have as many sharp edges." "Good fool," said the Duke vaguely. Totally mad, the fool thought. Several bricks short of a bundle, so far round the twist you could use him to open wine bottles. "Kneel beside me, my fool." The fool did so. The Duke laid a soiled bandage on his shoulder. "Are you loyal, fool?" he said. "Are you trustworthy?" "I swore to follow my lord until death," said the fool hoarsely. The Duke pressed his mad face close to the fool, who looked up into a pair of bloodshot eyes. "I didn't want to," he hissed conspiratorially. "They made me do it. I didn't want—" The door swung open. The Duchess filled the doorway. In fact, she was nearly the same shape. "Leonor!" she barked. The fool was fascinated by what happened to the Duke's eyes. The mad red flame vanished, was sucked backwards, and was replaced by the hard blue stare he had come to recognize. It didn't mean, he realized, that the Duke was any less mad. Even the coldness of his sanity was madness in a way. The Duke had a mind that ticked like a clock, and, like a clock, it regularly went cuckoo. Lord Felmet looked up calmly. "Yes, my dear?" "What is the meaning of all this?" she demanded. "Witches, I suspect," said Lord Felmet. "I really don't think—" the fool began. Lady Felmet's glare didn't merely silence him, it almost nailed him to the wall. "That is clearly apparent," she said. "You are an idiot." "A fool, my lady." "As well," she added, and turned back to her husband. "So," she said, smiling grimly, "still they defy you?" The Duke shrugged. "How should I fight magic?" he said. "With words," said the fool without thinking, and was instantly sorry. They were both staring at him. "What?" said the Duchess. The fool dropped his mandolin in his embarrassment. In the guild," said the fool, "we learned that words can be more powerful even than magic." "Clown," said the Duke. "Words are just words, brief syllables. Sticks and stones may break my bones." He paused, savouring the thought. "But words can never hurt me." "My lord, there are such words that can," said the fool. "Liar, usurper, murderer." The Duke jerked back and gripped the arms of the throne, wincing. "Such words have no truth," said the fool hurriedly. "But they can spread like fire underground, breaking out to burn." "It's true! It's true!" screamed the Duke. "I hear them all the time." He leaned forward. "It's the witches," he hissed. Then they can be fought with other words," said the fool. "Words can fight even witches." "What words?" said the Duchess thoughtfully. The fool shrugged. "Crone, evil eye, stupid old woman." The Duchess raised one thick eyebrow. "You are not entirely an idiot, are you?" she said. "You refer to rumour." "Just so, my lady." The fool rolled his eyes. What had he got himself into? "It's the witches," whispered the Duke, to no one in particular. "We must tell the world about the witches. They're evil. They make it come back, the blood. Even sandpaper doesn't work." There was another tremor as Granny Weatherwax hurried along the narrow, frozen pathways in the forest. A lump of snow slipped off a tree branch and poured over her hat. This wasn't right, she knew. Never mind about the whatever it was, but it was unheard of for a witch to go out on Hogswatch night. It was against all tradition. No one knew why, but that wasn't the point. She came out onto the moorland and pounded across the brittle heather, which had been scoured of snow by the wind. There was a crescent moon near the horizon, and its pale glow lit up the mountains that towered over her. It was a different world up there, and one even a witch would rarely venture into. It was a landscape left over from the frosty birth of the world, all green ice and knife-edge ridges and deep, secret valleys. It was a landscape never intended for human beings. Not hostile any more than a brick or cloud is hostile, but terribly, terribly uncaring. Except that this time it was watching her. A mind quite unlike any other she had ever encountered was giving her a great deal of its attention. She glared up at the icy slopes, half expecting to see a mountainous shadow move against the stars. "Who are you?" she shouted. "What do you want?" Her voice bounced and echoed among the rocks. There was a distant boom of an avalanche high among the peaks. On the crest of the moor, where in the summer partridges lurked among the bushes like small whirring idiots, was a standing stone. It stood roughly where the witches' territories met, although the boundaries were never formally marked out. The stone was about the same height as a tall man and made of bluish-tinted rock. It was considered intensely magical because, although there was only one of it, no one had ever been able to count it. If it saw anyone looking at it speculatively, it shuffled behind them. It was the most self-effacing monolith ever discovered. It was also one of the numerous discharge points for the magic that accumulated in the ramtops. The ground around it for several yards was bare of snow and steamed gently. The stone began to edge away and watched her suspiciously from behind a tree. She waited for 10 minutes, until Margaret came hurrying up the path from Mad Stoat, a village whose good-natured inhabitants were getting used to ear massage and flower-based homeopathic remedies for everything short of actual decapitation.
They worked. Witches' remedies generally did, regardless of the actual form of delivery.
She was out of breath, and wore only a shawl over a nightdress that, if Margaret had anything to reveal, would have been very revealing. "You felt it too," she said. Granny nodded. "Where's Githa?" she said. They looked down the path that led to Lankertown, a huddle of lights in the snowy gloom. There was a party going on. Light poured out into the street. A line of people were winding in and out of Nanny Ogg's house, from inside which came occasional shrieks of laughter and the sounds of breaking glass and children grizzling. It was clear that family life was being experienced to its limits in that house. The two witches stood uncertainly in the street. "Do you think we should go in?" said Margaret diffidently. It's not as though we're invited, and we haven't brought a bottle. Sounds to me as if there's a deal too many bottles in there already, said Granny Weatherwax disapprovingly. A man staggered out of the doorway, burped, bumped into Granny, said, "Happy Hogs Watch night, missus," glanced up at her face, and sobered up instantly. "Mistress," snapped Granny. "I am most frightfully sorry," he began. Granny swept imperiously past him. "Come, Margaret," she commanded. The din inside hovered around the pain threshold. Nanny Og got around the Hogs Watch night tradition by inviting the whole village in, and the air in the room was already beyond the reach of pollution controls. Granny navigated through the press of bodies by the sound of a cracked voice explaining to the world at large that, compared to an unbelievable variety of other animals, the hedgehog was quite fortunate. Nanny Og was sitting in a chair by the fire with a quart mug in one hand and was conducting the reprise with a cigar. She grinned when she saw Granny's face. "What-ho, my old boiler!" she screeched above the din. "See you turned up, then? Have a drink. Have two. Watch her, Margaret. Pull up a chair and call the cat a bastard." Grebo, who was curled up in the inglenook and watching the festivities with one slit yellow eye, flicked his tail once or twice. Granny sat down stiffly, a ramrod figure of decency. "We're not staying," she said, glaring at Margaret, who was tentatively reaching out towards a bowl of peanuts. "I can see you're busy. We just wondered whether you might have noticed anything tonight, a little while ago." Nanny Og wrinkled her forehead. "Our Darren's eldest was sick," she said. "Been at his dad's beer." "Unless he was extremely ill," said Granny. "I doubt if it was what I was referring to." She made a complex occult sign in the air, which Nanny totally ignored. "Someone tried to dance on the table," she said. "Fell into our wreath pumpkin dip. We had a good laugh." Granny waggled her eyebrows and placed a meaningful finger alongside her nose. "I was alluding to things of a different nature," she hinted darkly. Nanny Og peered at her. "Something wrong with your eye, Esme?" she hazarded. Granny Weatherwax sighed. "Extremely worrying developments of a magical tendency are even now afoot," she said loudly. The room went quiet. Everyone stared at the witches, except for Darren's eldest, who took advantage of the opportunity to continue his alcoholic experiments. Then, swiftly as they had fled, several dozen conversations hurriedly got back into gear. "It might be a good idea if we can go and talk somewhere more private," said Granny as the comforting hubbub streamed over them again. They ended up in the wash-house, where Granny tried to give an account of the mind she had encountered. "It's out there somewhere in the mountains and the high forests," she said, "and it is very big." "I thought it was looking for someone," said Margaret. "It put me in mind of a large dog, you know, lost, puzzled." Granny thought about this. Now she came to think of it. "Yes," she said, "something like that, a big dog." "Worried," said Margaret. "Searching," said Granny. "And getting angry," said Margaret. "Yes," said Granny, staring fixedly at Nanny. "Could be a troll," said Nanny Og. "I left best part of a pint in there, you know," she added reproachfully. "I know what a troll's mind feels like, Githa," said Granny. She didn't snap the words out. In fact, it was the quiet way she said them that made Nanny hesitate. "They say there's really big trolls up towards the hub," said Nanny slowly, "and ice giants, and big hairy wasp-names that live above the snow line. But you don't mean anything like that, do you?" "No." "Oh." Margaret shivered. She told herself that a witch had absolute control over her own body, and the goose pimples under her thin nightdress were just a figment of her own imagination. The trouble was, she had an excellent imagination. Nanny Og sighed. "We'd better have a look, then," she said, and took the lid off the copper. Nanny Og never used her wash-house, since all her washing was done by the daughters-in-law, a tribe of grey-faced, subdued women whose names she never bothered to remember. It had become, therefore, a storage place for dried-up old bulbs, burnt-out cauldrons, and fermenting jars of wasp jam. No fire had been lit under the copper for 10 years. Its bricks were crumbling, and rare ferns grew around the firebox. The water under the lid was inky black, and according to rumour, bottomless. The Og grandchildren were encouraged to believe that monsters from the dawn of time dwelt in its depths, since Nanny believed that a bit of thrilling and pointless terror was an essential ingredient of the magic of childhood. In summer, she used it as a beer cooler. "It'll have to do. I think perhaps we should join hands," she said. "And you, Margaret, make sure the door's shut." "What are you going to try?" said Granny. Since they were on Nanny's territory, the choice was entirely up to her. "I always say you can't go wrong with a good invocation," said Nanny. "Haven't done one for years." Granny Weatherwax frowned. Margaret said, "Oh, but you can't. Not here. You need a cauldron, and a magic sword, and an octagram, and spices, and all sorts of stuff." Granny and Nanny exchanged glances. "It's not her fault," said Granny. "It's all them grimmers she was bought." She turned to Margaret. "You don't need none of that," she said. "You need headology." She looked around the ancient washroom. "You just use whatever you've got," she said. She picked up the bleached copper stick and weighed it thoughtfully in her hand. "We conjure and abjure thee by means of this." Granny hardly paused. "Sharp and terrible copper stick." The waters in the boiler rippled gently. "See how we scatter," Margaret sighed. "Rather old washing soda and some extremely hard soap flakes in thy honour. Really, Nanny, I don't think—" "Silence. Now you, Gither." "And I invoke and bind thee with the balding, scrubbing brush of art and the washboard of protection," said Nanny, waving it. The ringer attachment fell off. "Honesty's all very well," whispered Margaret wretchedly, "but somehow it isn't the same." "You listen to me, my girl," said Granny. "Demons don't care about the outward shape of things. It's what you think that matters. Get on with it." Margaret tried to imagine that the bleached and ancient bar of lye soap was the rarest of scented whatever, ungulates or whatever they were, from distant Clatch. It was an effort. The gods alone knew what kind of demon would respond to a summoning like this. Granny was also a little uneasy. She didn't much care for demons in any case, and all this business with incantations and implements whiffed of wizardry. It was pandering to the things, making them feel important. Demons ought to come when they were called. But protocol dictated that the host witch had the choice, and Nanny quite liked demons, who were male, or apparently so. At this point, Granny was alternately cajoling and threatening the netherworld with 2 feet of bleached wood. She was impressed at her own daring. The waters seethed a little, became very still, and then, with a sudden movement and a little popping noise, mounded up into a head. Margaret dropped her soap. It was a good-looking head, maybe a little cruel around the eyes and beaky about the nose, but nevertheless handsome in a hard kind of way. There was nothing surprising about this. Since the demon was only extending an image of itself into this reality, it might as well make a good job of it. It turned slowly, a gleaming black statue in the fitful moonlight. "Well?" it said. "Who are you?" said Granny bluntly. The head revolved to face her. "My name is unpronounceable in your tongue, woman," it said. "I'll be the judge of that," warned Granny, and added, "Don't you call me woman." "Very well. My name is said the demon smugly. Where were you when the vows were handed out? Behind the door? Said Nanny Og. Well, Mr. Granny hesitated only fractionally. I expect you're wondering why we called you here tonight. You're not supposed to say that, said the demon. You're supposed to say, shut up. We have the sword of art and the octagram of protection. I warned you. Please yourself. They look like a washboard and a copper stick to me, sneered the demon. Granny glanced sideways. The corner of the washroom was stacked with kindling wood, with a big, heavy sawhorse in front of it. She stared fixedly at the demon and, without looking, brought the stick down hard across the thick timber. The dead silence that followed was broken only by the two perfectly sliced halves of the sawhorse, teetering backwards and forwards and folding slowly into the heap of kindling. The demon's face remained impassive. You are allowed 3 questions, it said. Is there something strange at large in the kingdom? Said Granny. It appeared to think about it. And no lying, said Margaret earnestly. Otherwise it'll be the scrubbing brush for you. You mean stranger than usual? Get on with it, said Nanny. My feet are freezing out here. No, there is nothing strange. But we felt it, Margaret began. Hold on, said Granny. Her lips moved soundlessly. Demons were like genies or philosophy professors. If you didn't word things exactly right, they delighted in giving you absolutely accurate and completely misleading answers. Is there something in the kingdom that wasn't there before? She hazarded. No. Tradition said that there could be only 3 questions. Granny tried to formulate one that couldn't be deliberately misunderstood. Then she decided that this was playing the wrong kind of game. What the hell's going on? She said carefully. And no mucking about, trying to wriggle out of it, otherwise I'll boil you. The demon appeared to hesitate. This was obviously a new approach. Margaret, just kick that kindling over here, will you? Said Granny. I protest at this treatment, said the demon, its voice tinged with uncertainty. Yes, well, we haven't got time to bandy legs with you all night, said Granny. These word games might be all right for wizards, but we've got other fish to fry. Or boil, said Nanny. Look, said the demon, and now there was a whine of terror in its voice. We're not supposed to volunteer information just like that. There are rules, you know. There's some old oil in the can on the shelf, Margaret, said Nanny. If I simply tell you, the demon began. Yes, said Granny encouragingly. You won't let on, will you? It implored. Not a word, promised Granny. Lips are sealed, said Margaret. There is nothing new in the kingdom, said the demon, but the land has woken up. What do you mean? Said Granny. It's unhappy. It wants a king that cares for it. How? Margaret began, but Granny waved her into silence. You don't mean people, do you? She said. The glistening head shook. No, I didn't think so. What? Nanny began. Granny put a finger to her lips. She turned and walked to the washhouse's window, a dusty spiderweb graveyard of faded butterfly wings and last summer's bluebottles. A faint glow beyond the frosted panes suggested that, against all reason, a new day would soon dawn. Can you tell us why? She said without turning round. She'd felt the mind of a whole country. She was rather impressed. I'm just a demon. What do I know? Only what is, not the why and how of it. I see. May I go now? Please? Granny jerked upright again. Oh, yes, run along, she said distractedly. Thank you. The head didn't move. It hung around like a hotel porter who has just carried 15 suitcases up 10 flights of stairs, shown everyone where the bathroom is, plumped up the pillows, and feels he has adjusted all the curtains he is going to adjust. "You wouldn't mind banishing me, would you?" said the demon when no one seemed to be taking the hint. "What?" said Granny, who was thinking again. "Only I'd feel better for being properly banished. Run along lacks that certain something," said the head. "Oh, well, if it gives you any pleasure. Margaret?" "Yes," said Margaret, startled. Granny tossed the copper stick to her. "Do the honours, will you?" she said. Margaret caught the stick by what she hoped Granny was imagining as the handle, and smiled. "Certainly. Right. Okay, Begone, foul fiend, unto the blackest pit." The head smiled contentedly as the words rolled over it. This was more like it. It melted back into the waters of the copper like candle wax under a flame. Its last contemptuous comment, almost lost in the swirl, was, "Run along." Granny went home alone as the cold pink light of dawn glided across the snow and let herself into her cottage. The goats were uneasy in their outhouse. The starlings muttered and rattled their false teeth under the roof. The mice were squeaking behind the kitchen dresser. She made a pot of tea, conscious that every sound in the kitchen seemed slightly louder than it ought to be. When she dropped the spoon into the sink, it sounded like a bell being hit with a hammer. She always felt uncomfortable after getting involved in organized magic, or, as she would put it, out of sorts with herself. She found herself wandering around the place looking for things to do and then forgetting them when they were half complete. She paced back and forth across the cold flagstones. It is at times like this that the mind finds the oddest jobs to do in order to avoid its primary purpose, i.e., thinking about things. If anyone had been watching, they would have been amazed at the sheer dedication with which Granny tackled such tasks as cleaning the teapot stand, rooting ancient nuts out of the fruit bowl on the dresser, and levering fossilized bread crusts out of the cracks in the flagstones with the back of a teaspoon. Animals had minds. People had minds, although human minds were vague, foggy things. Even insects had minds. Little pointy bits of light in the darkness of non-mind. Granny considered herself something of an expert on minds. She was pretty certain things like countries didn't have minds. They weren't even alive, for goodness sake. A country was... Hold on. A thought stole gently into Granny's mind and sheepishly tried to attract her attention. There was a way in which those brooding forests could have a mind. Granny sat up, a piece of antique loaf in her hand, and gazed speculatively at the fireplace. Her mind's eye looked through it, out at the snow-filled aisles of trees. Yes, it had never occurred to her before. Of course it'd be a mind made up of all the other little minds inside it. Plant minds, bird minds, bear minds, even the great slow minds of the trees themselves. She sat down in her rocking chair, which started to rock all by itself. She'd often thought of the forest as a sprawling creature, but only metaphorically, as a wizard would put it. Drowsy and purring with bumblebees in the summer, roaring and raging in autumn gales, curled in on itself and sleeping in the winter. It occurred to her that in addition to being a collection of other things, a forest was a thing in itself. Alive, only not alive in the way that, say, a shrew was alive. And much slower. That would have to be important. How fast did a forest's heart beat? Once a year, maybe? Yes, that sounded about right. Out there, the forest was waiting for the brighter sun and longer days that would pump 1,000,000 gallons of sap several hundred feet into the sky in one great systolic thump, too big and loud to be heard. and it was at about this point that Granny bit her lip. She just thought the word systolic, and it certainly wasn't in her vocabulary. Somebody was inside her head with her. Something. Had she just thought all those thoughts, or had they been thought through her? She glared at the floor, trying to keep her ideas to herself, but her mind was being watched as easily as if her head was made of glass. Granny Weatherwax got to her feet and opened the curtains. And they were out there on what, in warmer months, was the lawn. And every single one of them was staring at her. After a few minutes, Granny's front door opened. This was an event in its own right. Like most ramtoppers, Granny lived her life via the back door. There were only 3 times in your life when it was proper to come through the front door, and you were carried every time. It opened with considerable difficulty in a series of painful jerks and thumps. A few flakes of paint fell onto the snowdrift in front of the door, which sagged inward. Finally, when it was about halfway open, the door wedged. Granny sidled awkwardly through the gap and out onto the hitherto undisturbed snow. She had put her pointed hat on and the long black cloak which she wore when she wanted anyone who saw her to be absolutely clear that she was a witch. There was an elderly kitchen chair half buried in snow. In summer it was a handy place to sit and do whatever hand chores were necessary while keeping one eye on the track. Granny hauled it out, brushed the snow off the seat, and sat down firmly with her knees apart and her arms folded defiantly. She stuck out her chin. The sun was well up, but the light on this Hog's Watch day was still pink and slanting. It glowed on the great cloud of steam that hung over the assembled creatures. They hadn't moved, although every now and again one of them would stamp a hoof or scratch itself. Granny looked up at a flicker of movement. She hadn't noticed before, but every tree around her garden was so heavy with birds that it looked as though a strange brown and black spring had come early. Occupying the patch where the herbs grew in summer were the wolves, sitting or lolling with their tongues hanging out. A contingent of bears was crouched behind them, with a platoon of deer beside them. Occupying the metaphorical stalls was a rabble of rabbits, weasels, vermin, badgers, foxes, and miscellaneous creatures who, despite the fact that they lived their entire lives in a bloody atmosphere of hunter and hunted, killing or being killed by claw, talon, and tooth, are generally referred to as woodland folk. They rested together on the snow, their normal culinary relationships entirely forgotten, trying to outstare her. 2 things were immediately apparent to Granny. One was that this seemed to represent a pretty accurate cross-section of the forest life. The other, she couldn't help saying aloud. "I don't know what this spell is," she said, "but I'll tell you this for nothing. When it wears off, some of you little buggers had better get moving." None of them stirred. There was no sound, except for an elderly badger relieving itself with an embarrassed expression. "Look," said Granny. "What can I do about it? It's no good you coming to me. He's the new lord. This is his kingdom. I can't go meddling. It's not right to go meddling, on account of I can't interfere with people ruling. It has to sort itself out, good or bad. Fundamental rule of magic is that. You can't go round ruling people with spells because you'd have to use more and more spells all the time." She sat back, grateful that long-standing tradition didn't allow the crafty and the wise to rule. She remembered what it had felt like to wear the crown, even for a few seconds. No, things like crowns had a troublesome effect on clever folk. It was best to leave all the reigning to the kind of people whose eyebrows met in the middle when they tried to think. In a funny sort of way, they were much better at it. She added, "People have to sort it out for themselves. Well-known fact." She felt that one of the larger stags was giving her a particularly doubting look. "Yes, well, so he killed the old king. she conceded. That's nature's way, ain't it? Your lot know all about this. Survival of the what's name. You wouldn't know what an heir was unless you thought it was a sort of rabbit. She drummed her fingers on her knees. Anyway, the old king wasn't much of a friend to you, was he? All that hunting and such. 300 pairs of dark eyes bored in at her. It's no good you all looking at me, she tried. I can't go around mucking about with kings just because you don't like them. Where would it all end? Not as if he's done me any harm. She tried to avoid the gaze of a particularly cross-eyed stoat. All right, so it's selfish, she said. That's what being a witch is all about. Good day to you. She stamped inside and tried to slam the door. It stuck once or twice, which rather spoiled the effect. Once inside, she drew the curtains and sat down in the rocking chair and rocked fiercely. That's the whole point, she said. I can't go around meddling. That's the whole point. The latties lurched slowly over the rutted roads towards yet another little city whose name the company couldn't quite remember and would instantly forget. The winter sun hung low over the damp, misty cabbage fields of the Stowe Plains, and the foggy silence magnified the creaking of the wheels. Hewell sat with his stubby legs dangling over the backboard of the last latty. He'd done his best. Vittler had left the education of Tom John in his hands. You're better at all that business, he'd said, adding with his usual tact, besides, you're more his height. But it wasn't working. Apple, he repeated, waving the fruit in the air. Tom John grinned at him. He was nearly 3 years old and hadn't said a word anyone could understand. Hewell was harbouring dark suspicions about the witches. But he seems bright enough, said Mrs. Vittler, who was travelling inside the latty and darning the chainmail. He knows what things are. He does what he's told. I just wish you'd speak, she said softly, patting the boy on the cheek. Hewell gave the apple to Tom John, who accepted it gravely. I reckon them witches did you a bad turn, missus, said the dwarf. You know, changelings and what-not. There used to be a lot of that sort of thing. My great-great-grandmother said it was done to us once. The fairies swapped a human and a dwarf. We never realised until he started banging his head on things, they say. They say this fruit be like unto the world, so sweet, or like, say I, the heart of man, so red without, and yet within unclued, we find the worm, the rot, the flaw. However glows his bloom, the bite proves many a man be rotten at the core. The two of them swivelled around to stare at Tom John, who nodded to them and proceeded to eat the apple. That was a worm's beat from the tyrant, whispered Hewell. His normal grasp of the language temporarily deserted him. Bloody hell, he said. But he sounded just like... I'm going to get Vittler, said Hewell, and dropped off the tailboard and ran through the frozen puddles to the front of the convoy, where the actor-manager was whistling tunelessly and, yes, strolling. What ho, Zugdahjara, he said cheerfully.
A killing insult in dwarfish, but here used as a term of endearment. It means lawn ornament.
You've got to come at once. He's talking. Talking? Hewell jumped up and down. He's quoting, he shouted. You've got to come. He sounds just like... Me? Said Vittler a few minutes later after they had pulled the latties into a grove of leafless trees by the roadside. Do I sound like that? Yes, chorused the company. Young Willikins, who specialised in female roles, prodded Tom John gently as he stood on an upturned barrel in the middle of the clearing. Here, boy, do you know my speech from Please Yourself? He said. Tom John nodded. He is not dead, I say, who lies beneath the stone, for if death could but hear... They listened in awed silence as the endless mists rolled across the dripping fields and the red ball of the sun floated down the sky. When the boy had finished, hot tears were streaming down Hoole's face. "By all the gods," he said, when Tom John had finished, "I must have been on damn good form when I wrote that." He blew his nose noisily. "Do I sound like that?" said Willikins, his face pale. Vittler patted him gently on the shoulder. "If you sounded like that, my bonny," he said, "you wouldn't be standing arse-deep in slush in the middle of these forsaken fields with nothing but liberated cabbage for thy tea." He clapped his hands. "No more, no more," he said, his breath making puffs of steam in the freezing air. "Backs to it, everybody. We must be outside the walls of Stow Lat by sunset." As the grumbling actors awoke from the spell and wandered back to the shafts of the latties, Vittler beckoned to the dwarf and put his arm around his shoulders, or rather around the top of his head. "Well," he said, "you people know all about magic, or so it is said. What do you make of it?" "He spends all his time round the stage, master. It's only natural that he should pick things up," said Hoole vaguely. Vittler leaned down. "Do you believe that?" "I believe I heard a voice that took my doggerel and shaped it and fired it back through my ears and straight into my heart," said Hoole simply. "I believe I heard a voice that got behind the crude shape of the words and said things I had meant them to say, but had not the skill to achieve. Who knows where such things come from?" He stared impassively into Vittler's red face. "He may have inherited it from his father," he said. And who knows what witches may achieve?" said the dwarf. Vittler felt his wife's hand pushed into his. As he stood up, bewildered and angry, she kissed him on the back of the neck. "Don't torture yourself," she said. "Isn't it all for the best? Your son has declaimed his first word." Spring came, and ex-King Verence still wasn't taking being dead lying down. He prowled the castle relentlessly, seeking for a way in which its ancient stones would release their grip on him. He was also trying to keep out of the way of the other ghosts. Champot was all right, if a bit tiresome, but Verence had backed away at the first sight of the twins, toddling hand in hand along the midnight corridors, their tiny ghosts a memorial to a deed darker even than the usual run of regicidal unpleasantness. And then there was the troglodyte wanderer, a rather faded monkey man in a furry loincloth, who apparently happened to haunt the castle merely because it had been built on his burial mound. For no obvious reason, a chariot with a screaming woman in it occasionally rumbled through the laundry room. As for the kitchen, one day he'd given in, despite everything old Champot had said, and had followed the smells of cooking into the big, hot, high-domed cavern that served the castle as kitchen and abattoir. Funny thing, that. He'd never been down there since his childhood. Somehow kings and kitchens didn't go well together. It was full of ghosts. But they weren't human. They weren't even proto-human. They were stags, they were bullocks, they were rabbits and pheasants and partridges and sheep and pigs. There were even some round blobby things that looked unpleasantly like the ghosts of oysters. They were packed so tightly that in fact they merged and mingled, turning the kitchen into a silent, jostling nightmare of teeth and fur and horns, half seen and misty. Several noticed him, and there was a weird blarting of noises that sounded far off, tinny and unpleasantly out of register. Through them all, the cook and his assistants wandered quite unconcernedly, making vegetarian sausages. Verence had stared for half a minute and then fled, wishing that he still had a real stomach so that he could stick his fingers down his throat and bring up everything he'd eaten the last 40 years. He'd sought solace in the stables, where his beloved hunting dogs had whined and scratched at the door and had generally been very ill at ease at his sensed but unseen presence. Now he haunted, and how he hated the word, the long gallery, where paintings of long-dead kings looked down at him from the dusty shadows. He would have felt a lot more kindly towards them if he hadn't met a number of them, gibbering in various parts of the premises. Verence had decided that he had two aims in death. One was to get out of the castle and find his son, and the other was to get his revenge on the Duke. But not by killing him, he decided, even if he could find a way, because an eternity in that giggling idiot's company would lend a new terror to death. He sat under a painting of Queen Bemery, 670 to 722, whose rather stern good looks he would have felt a whole lot happier about if he hadn't seen her earlier that morning walking through the wall. Verence tried to avoid walking through walls. A man had his dignity. He became aware that he was being watched. He turned his head. There was a cat sitting in the doorway, subjecting him to a slow blink. It was a mottled grey and extremely fat. No, it was extremely big. It was covered with so much scar tissue that it looked like a fist with fur on it. Its ears were a couple of perforated stubs, its eyes two yellow slits of easy-going malevolence, its tail a twitching series of question marks as it stared at him. Grebo had heard that Lady Felmet had a small white female cat and had strolled up to pay his respects. Verence had never seen an animal with so much built-in villainy. He didn't resist as it waddled across the floor and tried to rub itself against his legs, purring like a waterfall. "Well, well," said the king vaguely. He reached down and made an effort to scratch it behind the two ragged bits on top of its head. It was a relief to find someone else besides another ghost who could see him, and Grebo, he couldn't help feeling, was a distinctly unusual cat. Most of the castle cats were either pampered pets or flat-eared kitchen and stable habitués who generally resembled the very rodents they lived on. This cat, on the other hand, was its own animal. All cats give that impression, of course, but instead of the mindless animal self-absorption that passes for secret wisdom in the creatures, Grebo radiated genuine intelligence. He also radiated a smell that would have knocked over a wall and caused sinus trouble in a dead fox. Only one type of person kept a cat like this. The king tried to hunker down and found he was sinking slightly into the floor. He pulled himself together and drifted upwards. Once a man allowed himself to go native in the ethereal world, there would be no hope for him, he felt. Only close relatives and the psychically inclined, Death had said. There weren't many of either in the castle. The Duke qualified under the first heading, but his relentless self-interest made him about as psychically useful as a carrot. As for the rest, only the cook and the fool seemed to qualify. But the cook spent a lot of his time weeping in the pantry because he wasn't being allowed to roast anything more bloody than a parsnip, and the fool was already such a bundle of nerves that Verence had given up his attempts to get through. A witch, now. If a witch wasn't psychically inclined, then he, King Verence, was a puff of wind. He had to get a witch into the castle. And then he'd got a plan. In fact, it was more than that. It was a plan. He spent months over it. He hadn't got anything else to do except think. Death had been right about that. All that ghosts had were thoughts, and although thoughts in general had always been alien to the king, the absence of any body to distract him with its assorted humours had actually given him the chance to savour the joys of cerebration. He'd never had a plan before, or at least one that went much further than, "Let's find something and kill it." And here, sitting in front of him, washing itself, was the key. "Here, pussy," he ventured. Grebo gave him a penetrating yellow stare. "Cat," the king amended hastily and backed away, beckoning. For a moment it seemed that the cat wouldn't follow, and then, to his relief, Grebo stood up, yawned, and padded towards him. Grebo didn't often see ghosts and was vaguely interested in this tall, bearded man with the see-through body. The king led him along a dusty side corridor and towards a lumber room crammed with crumbling tapestries and portraits of long-dead kings. Grebo examined it critically and then sat down in the middle of the dusty floor, looking at the king expectantly. "There's plenty of mice and things in here, do you see?" said Verence. "And the rain blows in through the broken window. Plus, there's all these tapestries to sleep on." "Sorry," the king added, and turned to the door. This was what he had been working on all these months. When he was alive, he had always taken a lot of care of his body, and since being dead, he had taken care to preserve its shape. It was too easy to let yourself go and become all fuzzy around the edges. There were ghosts in the castle who were mere pale blobs. But Verence had wielded iron self-control and exercised. Well, had thought hard about exercise, and fairly bulged with spectral muscles. Months of pumping ectoplasm had left him in better shape than he had ever been, apart from being dead. Then he'd started out small, with dust motes. The first one had nearly killed him.
In a manner of speaking.
But he'd persevered and progressed to sand grains, then whole-dried peas. He still didn't dare venture into the kitchens, but he had amused himself by oversalting Felmet's food a pinch at a time until he pulled himself together and told himself that poisoning wasn't honourable, even against vermin. Now he leaned all his weight on the door, and with every microgram of his being, forced himself to become as heavy as possible. The sweat of autosuggestion dripped off his nose and vanished before it hit the floor. Grebo watched with interest as ghostly muscles moved on the king's arms like footballs mating. The door began to move, creaked, then accelerated and hit the doorway with a thump. The latch clicked into place. It bloody well had to work now, Verence told himself. He'd never be able to lift the latch by himself. But a witch would certainly come looking for her cat. Wouldn't she? In the hills beyond the castle, the fool lay on his stomach and stared into the depths of a little lake. A couple of trout stared back at him. Somewhere on the disk, reason told him, there must be someone more miserable than he was. He wondered who it was. He hadn't asked to be a fool, but it wouldn't have mattered if he had, because he couldn't recall anyone in his family ever listening to anything he said after Dad ran away. Certainly not Grandad. His earliest memory was of Grandad standing over him, making him repeat the jokes by rote, and hammering home every punchline with his belt. It was thick leather, and the fact that it had bells on didn't improve things much. Grandad was credited with 7 official new jokes. He'd won the honorary cap and bells of the Grand Prix des Idiots blithering at Ankh-Morpork 4 years in a row, which no one else had ever done, and presumably they made him the funniest man who ever lived. He had worked hard at it. You had to give him that. The fool recalled with a shudder how, at the age of 6, he timidly approached the old man after supper with a joke he'd made up. It was about a duck. It had earned him the biggest thrashing of his life, which even then must have presented the old joker with a bit of a challenge. "You will learn, my lad," he recalled, with every sentence punctuated by jingling cracks, "that there is nothing more serious than jesting. From now on, you will never—" The old man paused to change hands. "Never, never, ever utter a joke that has not been approved by the guild. Who are you to decide what is amusing? Marry, let the untutored giggle at unskilled banter. It is the laughter of the ignorant. Never, never, never let me catch you joculating again." After that, he'd gone back to learning the 383 guild-approved jokes, which was bad enough. and the glossary, which was a lot bigger and much worse. And then he'd been sent to Ankh, and there, in the bare, severe rooms, he'd found there were books other than the great, heavy, brass-bound monster fun book. There was a whole circular world out there, full of weird places and people doing interesting things like singing. He could hear singing. He raised his head cautiously and jumped at the tinkle of the bells on his cap, gripped the hated things hurriedly. The singing went on. The fool peeped cautiously through the drift of meadowsweet that was providing him with perfect concealment. The singing wasn't particularly good. The only word the singer appeared to know was la, but she was making it work hard. The general tune gave the impression that the singer believed that people were supposed to sing la 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 in certain circumstances and was determined to do what the world expected of her. The fool risked raising his head a little further and saw Margaret for the first time. She had stopped dancing rather self-consciously through the narrow meadow and was trying to plait some daisies in her hair without much success. The fool held his breath. On long nights on the hard flagstones, he had dreamed of women like her. Although, if he really thought about it, not much like her. They were better endowed around the chest, their noses weren't so red and pointed, and their hair tended to flow more. But the fool's libido was bright enough to tell the difference between the impossible and the conceivably attainable, and hurriedly cut in some filter circuits. Margaret was picking flowers and talking to them. The fool strained to hear. "Here's woolly fellwort," she said, "and treacle worm seed, which is for inflammation of the ears." Even Nanny Ogg, who took a fairly cheerful view of the world, would have been hard put to say anything complimentary about Margaret's voice. But it fell on the fool's ears like blossom. "And 5-leaved false mandrake, sovereign against fluxes of the bladder. Ah, and here's old man's frog bit. That's for constipation." The fool stood up sheepishly in a carillon of jingles. To Margaret, it was as if the meadow, hitherto supporting nothing more hazardous than clouds of pale blue butterflies and a few self-employed bumblebees, had sprouted a large, red and yellow demon. It was opening and shutting its mouth. It had 3 menacing horns. An urgent voice at the back of her mind said, "You should run away now, like a timid gazelle. This is the accepted action in these circumstances." Common sense intervened. In her most optimistic moments, Margaret would not have compared herself to a gazelle, timid or otherwise. Besides, it added, the basic snag about running away like a timid gazelle was that in all probability she would easily outdistance him. Said the apparition. Uncommon sense, which, despite Granny Weatherwax's general belief that Margaret was several sticks short of a bundle, she still had in sufficiency pointed out that few demons tinkled pathetically and appeared to be quite so breathless. "Hello," she said. The fool's mind was also working hard. He was beginning to panic. Margaret shunned the traditional pointed hat as worn by the other witches, but she still held to one of the most fundamental rules of witchcraft. It's not much use being a witch unless you look like one. In her case, this meant lots of silver jewellery with octograms, bats, spiders, dragons, and other symbols of everyday mysticism. Margaret would have painted her fingernails black, except that she didn't think she would be able to face Granny's withering scorn. It was dawning on the fool that he had surprised a witch. "Whoops," he said, and turned to run for it. "Don't!" Margaret began, but the fool was already pounding down the forest path that led back to the castle. Margaret stood and stared at the wilting posy in her hands. She ran her fingers through her hair, and a shower of wilted petals fell out. She felt that an important moment had been allowed to slip out of her grasp as fast as a greased pig in a narrow passageway. She felt an overpowering urge to curse. She knew a great many curses. Goody Wemper had been really imaginative in that department. Even the creatures of the forest used to go past her cottage at a dead run. She couldn't find a single one that fully expressed her feelings. "Oh, bugger," she said. It was a full moon again that night, and most unusually, all 3 witches arrived at the Standing Stone early. It was so embarrassed by this that it went and hid in some gorse bushes. "Grebo hasn't been home for 2 days," said Nanny Og as soon as she arrived. "It's not like him. I can't find him anywhere." "Cats can look after themselves," said Granny Weatherwax. "Countries can't. I have intelligence to report. Light the fire, Margaret." "Hmm?" "I said light the fire, Margaret." "Hmm? Oh, yes." The 2 old women watched her drift vaguely across the moorland, tugging absently at dried-up wind clumps. Margaret seemed to have her mind on something. "Doesn't seem to be her normal self," said Nanny Og. "Yes, could be an improvement," said Granny shortly, and sat down on a rock. "She should have got it lit before we arrived. It's her job." "She means well," said Nanny Og, studying Margaret's back reflectively. "I used to mean well when I was a girl, but that didn't stop the sharp end of Goody Filter's tongue. Youngest witch serves her time. You know how it is. We had it tougher too. Look at her. Doesn't even wear the pointy hat. How's anyone going to know?" "You've got something on your mind, Esme," said Nanny. Granny nodded gloomily. "Had a visit yesterday," she said. "Me too." Despite her worries, Granny was slightly annoyed at this. "Who from?" she said. "The Major of Lanka and a bunch of burghers. They're not happy about the king. They want a king they can trust." "I wouldn't trust any king a burgher could trust," said Granny. "Yes, but it's not good for anyone, all this taxing and killing folk. The new sergeant they've got is a keen man when it comes to setting fire to cottages, too. Old Verence used to do it too, mind, but, well." I know. It was more personal," said Granny. "You felt he meant it. People like to feel they're valued." "This felmet hates the kingdom," Nanny went on. "They all say it. They say when they go to talk to him, he just stares at them and giggles and rubs his hand and twitches a bit." Granny scratched her chin. "The old king used to shout at them and kick them out of the castle, mind. He used to say he didn't have time for shopkeepers and such," she added with a note of personal approval. "But he was always very gracious about it," said Nanny Og. "And the kingdom is worried," said Granny. "Yes, I already said. I didn't mean the people. I meant the kingdom," Granny explained. Nanny interrupted a few times with brief questions. It didn't occur to her to doubt anything she heard. Granny Weatherwax never made things up. At the end of it, she said, "Well, my feelings exactly." "Fancy that." "Quite so." "And what did the animals do then?" "Went away. It had brought them there. It let them go." "No one let anyone else?" "Not where I saw." "Funny thing." "Right enough." Nanny Og stared at the setting sun. "I don't reckon a lot of kingdoms do that sort of thing," she said. "You saw the theatre. Kings and such are killing one another the whole time. Their kingdoms just make the best of it. How come this one takes offence all of a sudden?" "It's been here a long time," said Granny. "So's everywhere," said Nanny, and added with the air of a lifetime student, "Everywhere's been where it is ever since it was first put there. It's called geography." "That's just about land," said Granny. "It's not the same as a kingdom. A kingdom is made up of all sorts of things. Ideas, loyalties, memories. It all sort of exists together. And then all these things create some kind of life. Not a body kind of life, more like a living idea, made up of everything that's alive and what they're thinking, and what the people before them thought." Margaret reappeared and began to lay the fire with the air of one in a trance. "I can see you've been thinking about this a lot," said Nanny, speaking very slowly and carefully. "And this kingdom wants a better king. Is that it?" "No. That is, yes. Look." She leaned forward. "It doesn't have the same kind of likes and dislikes as people, right?" Nanny Og leaned back. "Well, it wouldn't, would it?" she ventured. "It doesn't care if people are good or bad. I don't think it could even tell, any more than you could tell if an ant was a good ant. But it expects the king to care for it." "Yes, but," said Nanny wretchedly. She was becoming a bit afraid of the gleam in Granny's eye. "Lots of people have killed each other to become king of Lancre. They've done all kinds of murder." Don't matter," said Granny, waving her arms. She counted on her fingers. "For why?" she said. "1. Kings go round killing each other because it's all part of destiny and such, and doesn't count as murder. And 2, they killed for the kingdom. That's the important bit. But this new man just wants the power. He hates the kingdom." "It's a bit like a dog, really," said Margaret. Granny looked at her with her mouth open to frame some suitable retort, and then her face softened. "Very much like," she said. "A dog doesn't care if its master's good or bad, just so long as it likes the dog." "Well then," said Nanny, "no one and nothing likes Felmet. What are we going to do about it?" "Nothing. You know we can't meddle." "You saved that baby," said Nanny. "That's not meddling." "Have it your way," said Nanny. "But maybe one day he'll come back. Destiny again. And you said we should hide the crown. It'll all come back, mark my words. Hurry up with that tea, Margaret." "What are you going to do about the burgers?" said Granny. "I told them they'll have to sort it out themselves." "Once we use magic," I said, "it'll never stop. You know that." "Right," said Granny, but there was a hint of wishfulness in her voice. "I'll tell you this, though," said Nanny. "They didn't like it much. They was muttering when they left." Margaret blurted out, "You know the fool who lives up at the castle?" "Little man with runny eyes?" said Nanny, relieved that the conversation had returned to more normal matters. "Not that little," said Margaret. "What's his name? Do you happen to know?" "He's just called Fool," said Granny. "No job for a man, that, running around with bells on." "His mother was a beldame from over Blackglass Way," said Nanny Og, whose knowledge of the genealogy of Lancre was legendary. "Bit of a beauty when she was younger. Broke many a heart, she did. Bit of a scandal there, I did hear. Granny's right, though. At the end of the day, a fool's a fool." "Why do you want to know, Margaret?" said Granny Weatherwax. "Oh, one of the girls in the village was asking me," said Margaret, crimson to the ears. Nanny cleared her throat and grinned at Granny Weatherwax, who sniffed aloofly. "It's a steady job," said Nanny. "I'll grant you that." "Huh," said Granny. "A man who tinkles all day, no kind of husband for anyone, I'd say." "She'd always know where he was," said Nanny, who was enjoying this. "You just have to listen." "Never trust a man with horns on his hat," said Granny flatly. Margaret stood up and pulled herself together, giving the impression that some bits had to come quite a long way. "You're a pair of silly old women," she said quietly, "and I'm going home." She marched off down the path to her village without another word. The old witches stared at one another. "Well," said Nanny. "It's all these books they read today," said Granny. "It overheats the brain. You haven't been putting ideas in her head, have you?" "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean." Nanny stood up. "I certainly don't see why a girl should have to be single her whole life just because you think it's the right thing," she said. "Anyway, if people didn't have children, where would we be?" "None of your girls is a witch," said Granny, also standing up. "It could have been," said Nanny defensively. "Yes, if you'd let them work it out for themselves instead of encouraging them to throw themselves at men. They're good-looking. You can't stand in the way of human nature. You'd know that if you'd ever—" If I'd ever what? Said Granny Weatherwax quietly. They stared at one another in shocked silence. They could both feel it, the tension creeping into their bodies from the ground itself, the hot, aching feeling that they'd started something they must finish, no matter what. I knew you when you were a girl, said Nanny sullenly. Stuck up you were. At least I spent most of the time upright, said Granny. Disgusting, that was. Everyone thought so. How would you know? Snapped Nanny. You were the talk of the whole village, said Granny. And you were too. They called you the Ice Maiden. Never knew that, did you? Sneered Nanny. I wouldn't sully my lips by saying what they called you, shouted Granny. Oh, yes, shrieked Nanny. Well, let me tell you, my good woman, don't you dare talk to me in that tone of voice. I'm not anyone's good woman. Right. There was another silence while they stared at one another nose to nose. But this silence was a whole quantum level of animosity higher than the last one. You could have roasted a turkey in the heat of this silence. There was no more shouting. Things had got far too bad for shouting. Now the voices came in low and full of menace. I should have known better than to listen to Margaret, growled Granny. This coven business is ridiculous. It attracts entirely the wrong sort of people. I'm very glad we had this little talk, hissed Nanny Ogg. Cleared the air. She looked down. And you're in my territory, madam. Madam! Thunder rolled in the distance. The permanent Lanka storm, after a trip through the foothills, had drifted back towards the mountains for a one-night stand. The last rays of sunset shone livid through the clouds, and fat drops of water began to thud on the witches' pointed hats. I really don't have time for all this, snapped Granny, trembling. I have far more important things to do. And me, said Nanny. Good night to you. And you. They turned their backs on one another and strode away into the downpour. The midnight rain drummed on Margaret's curtained windows as she thumbed her way purposefully through Goody Wemper's books of what, for want of a better word, could be called natural magic. The old woman had been a great collector of such things and, most unusually, had written them down. Witches didn't normally have much use for literacy, but book after book was filled with tiny, meticulous handwriting detailing the results of patient experiments in applied magic. Goody Wemper had, in fact, been a research witch.
Someone has to do it. It's all very well calling for eye of newt, but do you mean common, spotted, or great-crested? Which eye, anyway? Will tapioca do just as well? If we substitute egg white, will the spell A work, B fail, or C melt the bottom out of the cauldron? Goody Wemper's curiosity about such things was huge and insatiable. Nearly insatiable. It was probably satiated in her last flight to test whether a broomstick could survive having its bristles pulled out one by one in mid-air. According to the small black raven she had trained as a flight recorder, the answer was almost certainly no.
Margaret was looking up love spells. Every time she shut her eyes, she saw a red and yellow figure on the darkness inside. Something had to be done about it. She shut the book with a snap and looked at her notes. First, she had to find out his name. The old peel the apple trick should do that. You just peeled an apple, getting one length of peel, and threw the peel behind you. It'd land in the shape of his name. Millions of girls had tried it, and had inevitably been disappointed, unless the loved one was called Sksksk. That was because they hadn't used an unripe sunset wonder picked 3 minutes before noon on the first frosty day in the autumn and peeled left-handedly using a silver knife with a blade less than half an inch wide. Goody had done a lot of experimenting and was quite explicit on the subject. Margaret always kept a few by for emergencies, and this probably was one. She took a deep breath and threw the peel over her shoulder. She turned slowly. I'm a witch, she told herself. This is just another spell. There's nothing to be frightened of. Get a grip of yourself, girl. Woman. She looked down and bit the back of her hand out of nervousness and embarrassment. Who'd have thought it? She said aloud. It had worked. She turned back to her notes, her heart fluttering. What was next? Ah, yes, gathering fern seed in a silk handkerchief at dawn. Goody Wemper's tiny handwriting went on for 2 pages of detailed botanical instructions which, if carefully followed, resulted in the kind of love potion that had to be kept in a tightly stoppered jar at the bottom of a bucket of iced water. Margaret pulled open her back door. The thunder had passed, but now the first grey light of the new day was drowned in a steady drizzle. But it still qualified as dawn, and Margaret was determined. Brambles tugging at her dress, her hair plastered against her head by the rain, she set out into the dripping forest. The trees shook, even without a breeze. Nanny Ogg was also out early. She hadn't been able to get any sleep anyway, and besides, she was worried about Grebo. Grebo was one of her few blind spots. While intellectually she would concede that he was indeed a fat, cunning, evil-smelling multiple rapist, she nevertheless instinctively pictured him as the small fluffy kitten he had been decades before. The fact that he had once chased a female wolf up a tree and seriously surprised a she-bear who had been innocently digging for roots didn't stop her worrying that something bad might happen to him. It was generally considered by everyone else in the kingdom that the only thing that might slow Grebo down was a direct meteorite strike. Now she was using a bit of elementary magic to follow his trail, although anyone with a sense of smell could have managed it. It had led her through the damp streets and to the open gates of the castle. She gave the guards a nod as she went through. It didn't occur to either of them to stop her, because witches, like beekeepers and big gorillas, went where they liked. In any case, an elderly lady banging a bowl with a spoon was probably not the spearhead of an invasion force. Life as a castle guard in Lanka was extremely boring. One of them, leaning on his spear as Nanny went past, wished there could be some excitement in his job. He will shortly learn the error of his ways. The other guard pulled himself together and saluted. "Morning, Mum." "Morning, our son," said Nanny, and set off across the inner courtyard. Like all witches, Nanny Ogg had an aversion to front doors. She went around the back and entered the keep via the kitchens. A couple of maids curtsied to her. So did the head housekeeper, whom Nanny Ogg vaguely recognised as a daughter-in-law, although she couldn't remember her name. And so it was that when Lord Felmet came out of his bedroom, he saw, coming along the passage towards him, a witch. There was no doubt about it. From the tip of her pointed hat to her boots, she was a witch, and she was coming for him. Margaret slid helplessly down a bank. She was soaked to the skin and covered in mud. Somehow, she thought bitterly, when you read these spells, you always think of it being a fine sunny morning in late spring. And she had forgotten to check what kind of bloody fern it bloody was. A tree tipped a load of raindrops onto her. Margaret pushed her sodden hair out of her eyes and sat down heavily on a fallen log, from which grew great clusters of pale and embarrassing fungus. It had seemed such a lovely idea. She'd had great hopes of the coven. She was sure it wasn't right to be a witch alone. You could get funny ideas. She dreamed of wise discussions of natural energies while a huge moon hung in the sky, and then possibly they'd try a few of the old dances described in some of Goody Wemper's books. Not actually naked, or sky-clad as it was rather delightfully called, because Margaret had no illusions about the shape of her own body, and the older witches seemed solid across the hems, and anyway that wasn't absolutely necessary. The book said that the old-time witches had sometimes danced in their shifts. Margaret had wondered about how you danced in shifts. Perhaps there wasn't room for them all to dance at once, she thought. What she hadn't expected was a couple of crotchety old women who were barely civil at the best of times and simply didn't enter into the spirit of things. Oh, they'd been kind to the baby in their own way, but she couldn't help feeling that if a witch was kind to someone, it was entirely for deeply selfish reasons. And when they did magic, they made it look as ordinary as housekeeping. They didn't wear any occult jewellery. Margaret was a great believer in occult jewellery. It was all going wrong, and she was going home. She stood up, wrapped her damp dress around her, and set off through the misty woods. And heard the running feet. Someone was coming through them at high speed without caring who heard him, and over the top of the sound of breaking twigs was a curious, dull jingling. Margaret sidled behind a dripping holly bush and peered cautiously through the leaves. It was Sean, the youngest of Nanny Ogg's sons, and the metal noise was caused by his suit of chainmail, which was several sizes too big for him. Lanka is a poor kingdom, and over the centuries the chainmail of the palace guards has had to be handed down from one generation to another, often on the end of a long stick. This one made him look like a bullet-proof bloodhound. She stepped out in front of him. "Is that you, Mistress Margaret?" said Sean, raising the flap of mail that covered his eyes. "Is Mam? What's happened to her? He's locked her up. Said she was coming to poison him, and I can't get down to the dungeons to see because there's all new guards. They say she's been put in chains." Sean frowned. "And that means something horrible's going to happen. You know what she's like when she loses her temper. We'll never hear the last of it, Miss." "Where are you going?" demanded Margaret. "To fetch our Jason and our Wayne and our Darren and our—" "Wait a moment." "Oh, Mistress Margaret, suppose they try to torture her. You know what a tongue she's got on her when she gets angry." "I'm thinking," said Margaret. "He's put his own bodyguards on the gates and everything." "Look, just shut up a minute, will you, Sean? When our Jason finds out, he's going to give the Duke a real seeing to, Miss. He says it's about time someone did." Nanny Ogg's Jason was a young man with the build and, Margaret had always thought, the brains of a herd of oxen. Thick-skinned though he was, she doubted whether he could survive a hail of arrows. "Don't tell him yet," she said thoughtfully. "There could be, put another way." "I'll go and find Granny Weatherwax, shall I, Miss?" said Sean, hopping from one leg to another. "She'll know what to do. She's a witch." Margaret stood absolutely still. She had thought she was angry before, but now she was furious. She was wet and cold and hungry, and this person... Once upon a time she heard herself thinking she would have burst into tears at this point. "Oops," said Sean. I didn't mean... Whoops. He backed away. "If you happen to see Granny Weatherwax," said Margaret slowly in tones that could have etched her words into glass, "you can tell her that I will sort it all out. Now go away before I turn you into a frog. You look like one anyway." She turned, hitched up her skirts, and ran like hell towards her cottage. Lord Felmet was one of nature's gloaters. He was good at it. "Quite comfortable, are we?" he said. Nanny Ogg considered this. "Apart from these stocks, you mean?" she said. "I am impervious to your foul blandishments," said the Duke. "I scorn your devious wiles. You are to be tortured, I'll have you know." This didn't appear to have the required effect. Nanny was staring around the dungeon with the vaguely interested gaze of a sightseer. "And then you will be burned," said the Duchess. "Okay," said Nanny. "Okay? Well, it's bloody freezing down here. What's that big wardrobe thing with the spikes?" The Duke was trembling. "Aha," he said. "Now you realise, eh? That, my dear lady, is an Iron Maiden. It's the latest thing. Well, may you... Can I have a go in it? You'll please fall on deaf... The Duke's voice trailed off. His twitch started up. The Duchess leaned forward until her big red face was inches away from Nanny's nose. "This insouciance gives you pleasure," she hissed, "but soon you will laugh on the other side of your face." "It's only got this side," said Nanny. The Duchess fingered a tray of implements lovingly. "We shall see," she said, picking up a pair of pliers. "And you need not think any others of your people will come to your aid," said the Duke, who was sweating despite the chill. "We alone hold the keys to this dungeon. Ha ha! You will be an example to all those who have been spreading malicious rumours about me. Do not protest your innocence. I hear the voices all the time, lying." The Duchess gripped him ferociously by the arm. "Enough," she rasped. "Come, Lionel. We will let her reflect on her fate for a while." "The faces, wicked lies. I wasn't there, and anyway he fell. My porridge, all salty," murmured the Duke, swaying. The door slammed behind them. There was a click of locks and a thudding of bolts. Nanny was left alone in the gloom. A flickering torch high on the wall only made the surrounding darkness more forbidding. Strange metal shapes designed for no more exalted purpose than the destruct testing of the human body cast unpleasant shadows. Nanny Ogg stirred in her chains. "All right," she said. "I can see you. Who are you?" King Verent stepped forward. "I saw you making faces behind him," said Nanny Ogg. "All I could do to keep a straight face myself." "I wasn't making faces, woman. I was scowling." Nanny squinted. "Here, I know you," she said. "You're dead." "I prefer the term passed over," said the king. "I'd bow," said Nanny.
Witches never curtsy.
"Only there's all these chains and things. You haven't seen a cat around here, have you?" "Yes, he's in the room upstairs, asleep." Nanny appeared to relax. "That's all right, then," she said. "I was beginning to worry." She stared around the dungeon again. "What's that big bed thing over there?" "The rack," said the king, and explained its use. Nanny Ogg nodded. "What a busy little mind he's got," she said. "I fear, madam, that I may be responsible for your present predicament," said Verent, sitting down on, or at least just above, a handy anvil. "I wished to attract a witch." "I suppose you're no good at locks?" "I fear they would be beyond my capabilities as yet, but surely—" The ghost of the king waved a hand in a vague gesture which encompassed the dungeon, Nanny, and the manacles. "To a witch, all this is just so much—" "Solid iron," said Nanny. "You might be able to walk through it, but I can't." "I didn't realise," said Verence. "I thought witches could do magic." "Young man," said Nanny, "you will oblige me by shutting up." "Madam, I am a king. You are also dead, so I wouldn't aspire to hold any opinions if I was you. Now just be quiet and wait, like a good boy." Against all his instincts, the king found himself obeying. There was no gainsaying that tone of voice. It spoke to him across the years from his days in the nursery. Its echoes told him that if he didn't eat it all up, he would be sent straight to bed. Nanny Ogg stirred in her chains. She hoped they would turn up soon. Said the king uneasily. "I feel I owe you an explanation." "Thank you," said Granny Weatherwax, and because Sean seemed to be expecting it, added, "You've been a good boy." "Yes, ma'am," said Sean. "Mum? Was there something else?" Sean twisted the end of his chainmail vest out of embarrassment. "It's not true what everyone's been saying about our mum, is it, Mum?" he said. "She doesn't go round putting evil curses on folk. Except for Davis the butcher. And old Cakebread, after he kicked her cat. But they wasn't what you'd call real curses, was they, Mum?" You can stop calling me Mum. Yes, Mum. They've been saying that, have they? Yes, Mum. Well, your mam does upset people sometimes. Sean hopped from one leg to another. Yes, Mum, but they says terrible things about you, Mum, saving your presence, Mum. Granny stiffened. What things? Don't like to say, Mum. What things? Sean considered his next move. There weren't many choices. A lot of things what aren't true, Mum, he said, establishing his credentials as early as possible. All sorts of things. Like, old Verence was a bad king and you helped him on the throne and you caused that bad winter the other year and old Norbert's cow didn't give no milk after you looked at it. Lot of lies, Mum, he added loyally. Right, said Granny. She shut the door in his panting face, stood in thought for a moment and retired to her rocking chair. Eventually she said once more, Right. A little later she added, She's a daft old besom. But we can't have people going round doing things to witches. Once you've lost your respect, you ain't got a thing. I don't remember looking at old Norbert's cow. Who's old Norbert? She stood up, took her pointed hat from its hook behind the door, and, glaring into the mirror, skewered it in place with a number of ferocious hatpins. They slid in one by one, as unstoppable as the wrath of God. She vanished into the outhouse for a moment and came back with her witch's cloak, which served as a blanket for sick goats when not otherwise employed. Once upon a time, it had been black velvet. Now it was just black. It was carefully and slowly fastened by a tarnished silver brooch. No samurai, no questing knight was ever dressed with as much ceremony. Finally, Granny drew herself up, surveyed her dark reflection in the glass, gave a thin little smile of approval, and left via the back door. The air of menace was only slightly dispelled by the sound of her running up and down outside, trying to get her broomstick started. Margaret was also regarding herself in the mirror. She dug out a startlingly green dress that was designed to be both revealing and clinging, and would have been if Margaret had anything to display or cling to, so she'd shoved a couple of rolled-up stockings down the front in an effort to make good the more obvious deficiencies. She had also tried a spell on her hair, but it was naturally magic-resistant, and already the natural shape was beginning to assert itself. A dandelion clock at about 2 p.m. Margaret had also tried makeup. This wasn't an unqualified success. She didn't have much practice. She was beginning to wonder if she'd overdone the eyeshadow. Her neck, fingers, and arms between them carried enough silverware to make a full-size dinner service, and over everything she had thrown a black cloak lined with red silk. In a certain light, and from a carefully chosen angle, Margaret was not unattractive. Whether any of these preparations did anything for her is debatable, but they did mean that a thin veneer of confidence overlaid her trembling heart. She drew herself up and turned this way and that. The clusters of amulets, magical jewellery, and occult bangles on various parts of her body jingled together. An enemy wouldn't only have to be blind to fail to notice that a witch was approaching, he'd have to be deaf as well. She turned to her work table and examined what she rather self-consciously, and never in Granny's hearing, called her tools of the craft. There was the white-handled knife, used in the preparation of magical ingredients. There was the black-handled knife, used in the magical workings themselves. Margaret had carved so many runes into its handle, it was in constant danger of falling in half. They were undoubtedly powerful, but... Margaret shook her head regretfully, went over to the kitchen dresser and took out the bread knife. Something told her that at times like these, a good sharp bread knife was probably the best friend a girl could have.